Okay. Welcome, everybody. Lovely to see you all. This is going to be the reason I wanted to do these talks on the Bible, the ones that are already on the internet, the walking tour through the Bible. The reason I wanted to do that is a twofold. First of all, I am a bit of a heretic, and I think a lot of talks on the Bible are very, 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 very bad. The reason I think they're so appalling is because when I was in Rome at the premier seminary in the world, the Gregorian University in Rome, I found that the way they taught us the Holy Scriptures was atrocious. I found it killed it. And of course, the Vatican Council, as I mentioned the other day, wants us to be people who are well familiar with the Holy Scriptures. And yet, what they did, the approach in Rome was, they sort of said, before you can pick up the book, you have to know a whole load of other things before you can know the book, before you can pick up the book. And so, for example, when you go to the higher realms of biblical studies in Rome, you spend years learning Coptic and Greek and Hebrew, obviously, and not Old Norse, but anyway, all these dead languages. So then you can read the Bible. So the Bible cannot be put into your hands, it seems, for you to appreciate it until you've done a whole load of other things. So there's a whole load of other sort of hoops for you to jump through before you're finally rewarded with being allowed to read the Bible. I'm exaggerating. There was one person who taught Holy Scripture at the Gregorian who was very good, and she was called Sister Elena Bosetti. She actually used to appear on Italian television and give a little talk about the Sunday readings on Rai Uno and so on. She was very good, but most of them were terrible. Now, one of the reasons they were so terrible is, in my humble opinion, and I realize I'm in a minority here, is because they did not engage with the idea that the Bible is a work of literature. And you have to approach the Bible as a work of literature. That's the first and foremost thing you have to do. In fact, the first thing you have to do is, you have to say, the first thing you have to do is say, St. Mark's Gospel is a book. And most people don't really seem to understand that at all. They just think it's a section of the Bible. No, it's a book. The Bible is a compendium of, I think, 72 or 74 books. It depends how you count. So St. Mark's Gospel, when it was first written, and for the first decades of its life, was a freestanding book. And therefore, it was a book that was passed around, and a book that was read, and a book that was picked up, and so on and so on, put down. Now, the other thing is, when you first think, oh, what's that book like? The first thing you ask, is it a big book or a small book? St. Mark's Gospel was a small book. It was a book that would take about, I reckon, 2 hours to read. Not very much. It's 16 chapters, so 2 hours you get through it. The other thing, of course, is don't forget, it was a book, but it wasn't what our type of book. Our type of books are called folios, or with leaves. They've got leaves, haven't they? A folio is when you fold it over. A quadro is, and so on and so forth. A folio is a big book, and you can get to an octavo volume and so on and so forth. Our books open like that, don't they? So, you mark your page. With St. Mark's Gospel, it would be a bit like two rolling pins, and between the rolling pins would be a very long length of parchment, or not parchment, sorry, of papyrus, of paper, made out of Egyptian papyrus, and you would scroll it. Now, you know this word scrolling because we use it with the computer. So you would be scrolling, you'd be twisting upwards and twisting downwards, and you would be reading the book that way. And the other thing, as I just mentioned, you would be reading it out loud. Even if you were on your own, you would be reading it out loud. Now, the other thing, of course, is papyrus was extremely expensive. Even though books were relatively common in the Roman Empire, most people had borrowed or even owned a few books, and a lot of people had access to libraries. Libraries were different to in our days. Libraries, you'd have shelves, and you'd have things like hat boxes on the shelves. You know what a hat box looks like. And in the hat box, you'd have these rolling pins that's what they look like, double rolling pins, with a label stuck to the top of the rolling pin saying what the book was. And then sometimes if they've got it wrong, you just have to check and so on and so forth. So, to find the scroll you were looking for, you'd have to have a shelf number and so on and so forth, and a box number. Now, the other thing is, of course, papyrus is extremely expensive, and therefore the book of the Gospel of St. Mark, like every other book, was written in capital letters, usually, with no spaces between words and no spaces between paragraphs. And so it was literally a line of text that went on for, I don't know, 300 feet or something, or 30 feet or whatever the length of the scroll was, because you didn't want to waste money, you didn't want to waste the parchment, and also no margins. So it would go completely, and they were very clever, the way they read, they were able to put in the spaces, which is quite extraordinary when you think about it. And the other thing, of course, is now when we pick up St. Mark's Gospel, we see spaces between words, we see spaces between paragraphs, and we also see what the St. Mark's Gospel has been chopped up. And quite often, if you look in your Bibles, you'll see a little heading, sort of Jesus goes to Capernaum, and then it says, Jesus then went to Capernaum. The cure of a leper. Jesus then met a leper and so on. And the cure of 10 lepers and so on. The crucifixion. Now, it's chopped up to make it easier for you to understand. But it wasn't like that originally. It was not chopped up into episodes. And it wasn't even divided up into words and paragraphs. So the idea of it being chopped up, we naturally think St. Mark's Gospel is a book of episodes. But it wasn't originally a book of episodes. It was a continuous thing. And people would have read it as a continuous thing. They would have stood there for 2 hours, usually read standing up, and you would read the whole thing from not cover to cover, but from spindle to spindle, and then you would put it aside. Now, the other thing, of course, is because books were few and far between, but they were relatively common, it was quite often the case that you would be reading and a whole load of people would be sitting there listening. And so they often had public readings of books. And this would have happened. And this is the origin of the readings at Mass, that originally they would read from the Gospel or read from the prophet Isaiah or whatever. And gradually over the years, these readings became shorter and shorter because people's attention span became less and less. But St. Augustine does say in one of his sermons, he started Mass at dawn, don't forget, he said, unfortunately, it's now growing dark, so I better hurry up. In other words, St. Augustine preached for about 7 hours on one occasion, or there was readings that went on for several hours. The Mass went on for all day. He said, I can see it's getting dark, and you are getting tired, he said. But he only said that once. Most of the time, he just ignored it. Now, the other thing about St. Mark's Gospel is it's a short book, a very short book. Why? This is its unique selling point. It is a short book. So the idea of St. Mark's Gospel was, at a time when the Christian message was being spread by word of mouth, people would then say, I'd like to know more. And people would say, let me give you this short book, and you can then read it. Now, originally, people heard the message as a preached message. You went along to a meeting, somebody stood up and talked, sometimes for 2 or 3 hours, and then you went away. Then these people who talked, the original apostles, the people who knew Jesus, and all those sorts of people, eventually they died off, they were killed off, and then eventually they said, well, you've heard the message, you want to know more, take this book and read this book, and then bring it back to me. So the book became a short introduction to Christianity, but not really. It became a short exposition of Christianity, 2 hours to learn the essence of the Christian message. Now, it's obvious to everybody nowadays that St. Mark's Gospel is the first Gospel, and that St. Matthew comes second, St. Luke comes third, St. John comes fourth. Simply because St. Matthew and St. Luke are expansions of St. Mark's Gospel. So, in other words, St. Matthew and St. Luke had Mark's Gospel in front of them, copied it out, and added bits on. They diced and spliced. So, St. Mark's Gospel, this is the shortest one, and then St. Matthew's is an expansion of St. Mark. St. Luke is an expansion of St. Mark. Okay, so it's the oldest Gospel. We don't know of the only way we have. There are two bits of evidence which tell us about its age. One bit of evidence is from a guy called Papias, who was writing about 90 AD, I think, and he said St. Mark was the assistant of St. Peter, and he wrote it all down after the death of St. Peter, and that basically he would be St. Peter's bag carrier. St. Peter's sermons were then made into the Gospel of Mark. The other thing is internal evidence, and internal evidence is very important. It's clear that St. Mark's Gospel would have been written roughly around the time of the siege of Jerusalem, because it does say in St. Mark's Gospel, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by enemies and so on and so forth, then you will know. And that happened in 72 AD or whatever it was. So probably St. Mark's Gospel was written before that, probably about, and they think 68 AD. Now, of course, one of the things that we've been told by a whole load of people who know nothing, namely atheists, is that we know nothing about Jesus Christ. And of course, the atheists are only parroting what was said by liberal Protestant theologians in the 19th century, who said that we have no direct evidence of anything about Jesus Christ. Rubbish. If St. Mark's Gospel was written in 68 AD, and if the Passion and Resurrection of Jesus happened at 27 AD, it's 40 years later. Now, you can all remember what was going on 40 years ago, can't you? What was 40 years ago? 1986? Yeah. And if I said to you, would you please sit down here and write me out a brief history of the glorious time of Mrs. Thatcher as Prime Minister, you'd not be able to do that. And you'd say, nobody would say, hey, hang on, this person, it was 40 years ago. She knows nothing about Mrs. Thatcher. It's all legend. It's all myth. This person called Mrs. Thatcher never existed. Now, come on. We all know she did exist. I know some of you have still not got over it as well. But we know 40 years is nothing in human memory. Nothing. And when I was a little boy in 1974, I was asking people about the war, which had been 30 years before. And they were telling me about the war with absolute clarity and historical accuracy. Things about rationing and bombing and things like that. So therefore, St. Mark is a reputable, reliable historical witness. There's no doubt about that. And of course, the other Gospels taking on St. Mark and so on and so forth. St. John comes much later, but probably not that much later, probably about 90 AD at the latest. And St. John is also a historical witness. Anyway, now, and so what, it was probably written in Rome, where St. Peter died, where he was crucified. And that is where the Gospel of Mark was written. There are one or two tiny little indications in the book it was written in Rome. We know, for example, it talks about Simon of Cyrene being the father of Alexander and Rufus. And of course, there was a guy called Rufus in Rome when St. Paul was writing to the Romans. Don't forget, St. Paul writing to the Romans would be before St. Mark's Gospel was written. Okay. Now, the other thing is, well, what's its purpose? Its purpose is very simple. It is to help a person decide what they think about this new religion. Now, when you read a book, generally speaking, I suppose the book could be a didactic book. It could be the sort of book that helps you revise your way of looking at the world. And you could say, and people still do, I read such and such a book and it really changed my life. So you read this book called The Atkins Diet and it really changed your life. Or you read this book about how to be your own car mechanic and it really changed my life. And so self-help manuals and things like that it really changed my life. But in fact, the Gospel of Mark is completely in a different sort of league. It is asking you to change from a curious person to being a person of faith, a fervent religious believer. That is what it is asking you to do. In other words, it's asking you to move from one way of living to another way of living. Now, not very many books want to do that. Most people, when they write a book, just want to entertain the audience. Even Jane Austen wanted to entertain the audience. Shakespeare wanted to entertain the audience. That's all they wanted to do. But this is not entertainment. This is not primarily informational. It is actually to get you to change the direction of your life, which is quite extraordinary, and which I don't think is, it's the unique selling point of the book, because I don't think that that was a thing before these Gospels were written, particularly the Gospel of Mark. It is a call to conversion. Now, that is, I think, important. Now, who wrote the Gospel? Who was this Mark guy? Don't forget, the Gospel's title, the Gospel according to St. Mark, is in fact editorial. The opening words are katamarkon, according to Mark. Or Mark here, this is what I think. That's basically what it's saying, according to Mark. Isn't there some famous book called According to So-and-so?
Gulp or something.
According to Garp or something. Yeah. It's quite a good wheeze. According to Mark. This is me, Mark. The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, etc. He actually starts the word, the beginning of the book with the beginning. So just in case you don't realise when you're actual beginning physically, that is the beginning. It hasn't been cut off or something like that. Now, if you look at, you can look at these sheets, or you can look at the actual text. 1451 to 52 is one of the very few verses that Luke and Matthew did not copy. All the other verses, more or less, of Mark, they copied. But this one, they cut out. Why did they cut it out? Because they thought it made no sense. They said, what's this? This is rubbish. Get rid of it. You know, when you're editing a text, you always want to clear up. You want to make things a bit clearer, and you also want to take out things that don't belong, which are distractions. And I don't know if any of you have ever written a book with a proper editor. The proper editor will say to you, look, you said that on page 41. You don't need to say it again. Get rid of it. Okay. And what's this there for? Yeah, get rid of it. Okay. Now a young man followed him, wearing nothing but a linen cloth around his body. They seized him, but he left the cloth behind and ran off naked. This is during the arrest of Jesus. Now we know what the disciples were doing at that time. We know what the temple guards were doing. We know what Judas was doing. Who is this young man? Well, here we have an analogy. You may have seen medieval paintings, and let's say a Virgin and Child, or a crucifixion, or even possibly, the what's it called, the Transfiguration, and a really beautiful painting. And you notice in the bottom left corner or right corner, a little man and a little woman kneeling down looking pious. And they've got nothing to do with what's going on in the painting. And you think, well, what are they doing there? And they are the people who paid for the painting. They are the patrons of the artist. They paid for this painting, so it would hang in their parish church or the church they liked or whatever. And it's their way of saying, hey, this is the Transfiguration of Jesus, but look, this is me, and that's the missus. And it's quite common. If you look at it in the National Gallery in the Sainsbury's Wing, you will see this quite often. Now, quite often, when you were writing a book, you put yourself into the book. And books were all anonymous in those days, and they were anonymous until the 19th century. Don't forget, Jane Austen published Pride and Prejudice. It was called Pride and Prejudice, a novel in 3 volumes by a lady. You could guess it was a lady. No man would write it. But, and possibly, just possibly, Jane Austen wrote herself into the book, maybe in 1 or 2 of the characters, and so on and so on. So that's what you do. So Mark is saying, this is me. I was there too. This is what's called a cameo, or a walk-on part. Makes perfect sense to me anyway. And the other thing, of course, is in the best Christian tradition, he is self-effacing. He said, this is me making a fool of myself. This is me not showing my best side, but showing, in fact, my bare bottom, or whatever he was showing. A young man followed him wearing nothing but a linen cloth. Now, where did this young man come from? Well, he followed him from where? From the room of the Last Supper. And it's possible that the room of the Last Supper belonged to Joanna, who was the mother of John Mark. And John Mark was not at the Last Supper, but he'd been sent to bed. And he'd crept down and he was spying on the people in the room of the Last Supper, looking through the banisters or whatever. And when they went off to the Garden of Gethsemane, which from the room of the Last Supper is about a 10-minute walk, he followed wearing his pajamas, or the equivalent of pajamas, a white linen cloth. And then, when it all went pear-shaped, they grabbed hold of him, but comically, they caught hold of the white linen cloth and he ran off starkers into the night. So that was him. Then, and of course it says a young man, and the word used for a young man, it basically could be, we'd probably say in modern English, a teenager. So 14 years old, 15 years old, something like that. Then the young man comes back. And here we have it in 16:5-7. On entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, that's the lucky side, the good side, so good news side, clothed in a white robe. So the young man ran off naked. Now he's got his clothes back and they're white. You see, white. And the word young man is used again. And it's a very rarely used word in the gospel. And they were utterly amazed, as well they might be. So, aren't you the one who ran off in naked? No. Anyway, they weren't there actually at the Garden of Gethsemane, because it's the women who go into the tomb. And he said to them, do not be amazed. You see Jesus of Nazareth, the crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Behold the place where they laid him. But go and tell his disciples and Peter, he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him as he told you. Now, who is this young man? Well, it's the same young man who ran off. The young man is the messenger of good news. Now, messenger in Greek is angel, angel. And angel also means it means a person flapping around with wings, as we know, but it also means somebody who brings you a message, i.e. the postman. So when next time you see your postman, say, oh, you are an angel. And the other thing is, if you're somebody who brings good news, you are an evangel. And what do we call Mark? We call him the evangelist, the bearer of good news. And so basically here he's saying they went into the tomb and they met a young man sitting on the right. They met the evangelist, the author of this gospel. So the author, now having got his clothes back and having got his act together, gives them the message. But he's been giving them the message throughout writing the gospel. So he appears in his own book. It's a bit like the equivalent of a piece de camera when you make a film or something like that. Okay, now that's the message he's got before you. There you will see him as he told you. He is not here, he is risen. That is the message. Now, okay, well, who is this message aimed at? 68 AD, Rome, where Mark was working for St. Peter. He was the Pope's secretary. Who is the message aimed at? It is aimed at the sort of people you would find in Rome. Now, Rome in those days was not a particularly large place. I think it probably had a population of about 100,000, 200,000 max, many of whom were slaves, therefore foreigners, many of whom were women, many of whom were Jewish. I mean, there were quite a few Jews in Rome, many of whom were, native Romans, stroke Italians, or people from Italy who'd gravitated to Rome, but also people from all over the Roman Empire, Gaul, Spain, etc. So it was a bit of a potpourri, a bit of a hodgepodge. They are the intended audience. It's an intended audience is the Gentiles, not necessarily Jewish people per se, but Gentiles. And people who might be of a Jewish background, but they don't have to be of a Jewish background. Now, I say that because there's not that much in Mark, or there's quite a lot in Mark, which presupposes that the audience is not au fait with the Jewish law. So, for example, there's this bit about the Jews have many, it says, there's some bit in Mark that says, the Jews have many, many rules about washing cups and plates. But it's not interesting, moving swiftly on. And so it's not aimed at Jews. It's aimed at everybody. In fact, it's aimed at Romans. How do we know it's aimed at Romans? Well, this is my theory anyway. And here we have the Gospel's intended audience. Jesus, this is 15:37 to 42. Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. The veil of the sanctuary was torn in two from top to bottom, which even if you're not Jewish, you get the symbolism of that. The door to heaven is now open. When the centurion who stood facing him saw how he breathed his last, he said, truly this man was Son of God. There's no the in Greek, by the way. Truly this man was Son of God. Now, that is the primary audience. The primary audience of this book is the centurion. This is the punchline of the whole book. This is the moment to which the whole book is working, that the centurion, the hard-bitten, efficient, and sometimes very cruel servant of the Roman Empire, says, truly this man was Son of God. And if a centurion says it, you know it must be true. Now, the Romans loved their army because it was the foundation of Roman greatness and it was the best army in the world. This used to be the case possibly in Britain in the 19th century. Everybody thought, that the redcoats or whatever they were called were the best army in the world. They went to Rorke's Drift and they won that against huge opposition and so on and so forth. You've seen the film Zulu, haven't you? It's the greatest film ever made. Have you seen the film Zulu? Yeah, it is the greatest film ever made, I think. Yeah, I mean, it comes up again and again. And Zulu also contains the world's greatest Englishman, doesn't it? Michael Caine, yeah. And so essentially, if you were making a film of St. Mark's Gospel, you would get Michael Caine to play the part of the centurion, if it was aimed at an English audience. As a matter of fact, you know who they got to play the centurion, don't you? John Wayne. Because he was the greatest American of all time, as indeed Elizabeth Taylor told us, didn't she, when he was on his deathbed. And so therefore, and for the Romans, the centurion was the archetypal, honest, down-to-earth backbone of the Roman Empire. And therefore, if a centurion gives witness and says, truly this man was Son of God, you sit up and take notice. The centurion is right. When I was a little boy, my mother said, if ever you get lost, go to find a policeman and the policeman will bring you home. Well, that was then, eh? You wouldn't do that to a child now, would you? I don't know. Would you? I don't know. We've got, no, not in Epsom, yeah. If you couldn't find one. So, of course, we've got some wonderful policemen in our parish. Because you can always trust the policeman. And similarly, the Roman mothers would have said to their children, if anything goes wrong, just find a centurion and he'll look after you, etc. So the centurion is the number one dependable person. If the centurion says, truly, this man was Son of God, then this man really was the Son of God. As the centurion comes to faith, seeing the way he had died, you, reading the book, come to faith as the centurion does. But let's say you're not quite there yet. You've got, immediately goes on, there are also women looking on from a distance. Now you do know, don't you, in Jewish terms, and I think also in Rome, ancient Rome, women suffered from quite a lot of legal disabilities. They were not allowed to lead troops into battle. Which Agrippina, who was pretty damn brave, found very, very hard to deal with. They were not allowed to lead troops into battle. They were not allowed to address the Senate, which the Empress Livia found pretty hard going. They were not allowed to. They had to, if they had influence, they had to do it from behind the scenes. They did have influence. They were not. I'm not sure whether women could give evidence in court. I'm not sure. Certainly, in the Jewish world, a man's evidence was the equal of two women's evidence. So if two women accused you of doing something and one man accused you, said no, you didn't, then it would balance out quite easily. You see. Okay. Now, so these women were there, looking on from a distance. Why weren't they up close? We have a tradition, don't we, that the Blessed Virgin Mary and St. John and the three Marys were up close. But in St. Mark's Gospel, it's different. The women are at a distance. What sort of distance? 200 yards, 30 yards, we don't know. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of the younger James, and of Joses, and Salome. These women had followed him when he was in Galilee and ministered to him. So, a little footnote. Who are these women? I haven't mentioned so far, but these were the women who followed him and ministered to him, which meant that they came from Galilee and they paid for everything. Essentially, is what they ministered. Because, I mean, he did have to eat and he did have to dress and have new shoes every now and then. There were also many other women who'd come up with him to Jerusalem. So there were these 1, 2, 3 important women. Mary Magdalene, who was probably rich in her own right, because her husband had died and left her the money. Mary, the mother of the younger James and Joses, whoever she was, probably Jesus' aunt, and Salome, who was the wife of Herod's steward chooser. She was quite an important person as well. Again, she had the money. And then there was also another gaggle of women who we're not going to mention by name because you've never heard of them. Maybe we know their names. And so why we've got the centurions up there front, these women are a little bit at a distance. I think it's saying here, these women believed in Jesus, but they had not yet proclaimed it. These women had followed him all this way from Galilee, but they had hung back from the last act on the cross. In other words, it's saying that there are lots of people nowadays who are following Jesus, but haven't quite completed the journey. That is to say, they're catechumens. They are people who come to Christian services, but have not taken the plunge, quite literally not taken the plunge. They have not been baptized yet. That's what I think that is saying. And also, it's probably, but it's also saying something else. You, the person reading this gospel, you are probably a woman, is what it's saying. Now, you know about chicklet, don't you? Many of you love chicklet. Yes, I know. Do you love chicklet? No. Oh. Okay, some of you are unnatural. But most of you love chicklet. Jane Austen is chicklet. Yeah, most men don't really dig Jane Austen that much. Chicklet, can you think of any really good chicklet? You don't know what we're talking about. Chicklet? What? Jimmy Cooper is wonderful. Yeah, okay, that's not quite chicklet. Chicklet is more.
Good chicklet is an oxymoron.
Yeah, good chicklet. So, what about BTB? Was that chicklet? Taylor Bradford.
No, it's more like Bridget Jones.
Yes, yeah, Bridget Jones. Anyway, chicklet had not been invented in those days. And obviously, an awful lot of the poetry was enjoyed by women. There's no doubt about that. Latin poetry would have been enjoyed by women. This is a book that is not aimed at women. It's a book that is written with the full knowledge that most of its readers will be women, simply because most of the converts to Christianity were women, probably. Now, this is interesting. In Roman times, women could not take part in religious ceremonies unless there were certain cults which were reserved for women. But in official Roman religion, they didn't get a look in. Most people didn't get a look in either, come to think of it. Because, the temple was quite small. The sacrifice took place outside. You watched and so, well, that's done. And then you went off to the bath or whatever. to be initiated into a religion, like the cult of Mithras, you had to be a man and a soldier, or the cult of Isis and all these other things. And there were one or two really weird cults, like the cult of Cybele, which you could be initiated into. You could be a Vestal Virgin, which was pretty damn dull, I should imagine. But the truth of the matter is, women were excluded from that side of life. And therefore, they were interested in the Christian religion because the Christian religion was for them. I mean, you could join the Christian religion if you were a woman, whereas pagan religions, honestly, most of them were shut to women. And we know that some very important women were Christians. So, for example, Flavia Domitilla was a Christian and was executed by her cousin, stroke uncle, stroke great uncle Domitian. Her cousin, once removed, Domitian, had her executed because she'd become a Christian. And her husband, he was also executed. He was not a terribly important person. Tacitus says he was fat and lazy, but nevertheless he got executed. And their children were heirs to the throne, believe it or not. And Flavia Domitilla was buried in the catacomb that bears her name. So Flavia Domitilla was a very important person in Rome, and she was a Christian. At the same time, a lot of the people who would be the audience for this book would be ordinary Romans who admired centurions, but you also have the female part, and then a lot of the people who were audience for this book would have been slaves, foreigners, because the slaves had no rights at all, and therefore they were, if you were a slave, you could join the Christian religion and you could become you would be somebody. You would be going along to the ceremonies of the Christian church along with people like Flavia Domitilla, who would treat you as an equal. Now, this also comes up here. Mary Magdalene, Mary of Magdala, Magdala was a very important place in those days. It was the center of making garum, that fish sauce that the Romans put on all their food. It's like Worcester sauce. And so it's quite possible she was rather an important person, a businesswoman. And Salome, the wife of Herod's steward Chusa, she would have been quite an important person. And who on earth Mary, the mother of the younger James, etc., is, I don't know. But the point is, it said important women were there. If you're an important woman reading this is obviously, don't feel that somehow this is not for you, because other important women have gone before you. Don't forget, Mary Magdalene would only have been dead for about a couple of years by the time this first came out. If not, she might still have been alive. You never know. Now, so that is the audience are the people being called to have faith in Jesus Christ and to change their lives. Now, books, honestly, we don't think of books doing that. Anyway, I've made that point. Let's go on to the next point, the ending of the gospel. Now, if you look at chapter 16, it's very short. There is, and you'll see editorially, there are two endings. It says a second ending or an alternative ending. Now, what you have here is the original ending, and then you have somebody who came along later and said, I don't like this original ending, I'm changing it, I'm rewriting the ending. This happened to poor old Shakespeare. Remember, there was a man called Nahum Tate who wrote that famous thing, While Shepherds Watch Their Flocks by Night. He said, I don't like this ending of King Lear, it's too harsh, I'm going to write it with a happy ending. And for about 200 years, the happy ending of Nahum Tate was the standard ending of King Lear. Now, so what happened is St. Mark's ending, clearly somebody found it wanting. Now, St. Mark's ending is just like this. They went out, it said, and fled from the tomb, the women, seized with trembling and bewilderment. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. End of gospel. Now, some people would say that that is a very strange ending. I think you could say it's a strange ending in the sense that they said nothing to anybody, means therefore the story never got told. Well, hang on, you're reading a book about the story, so it must have got told. Ergo, clearly later they changed their minds and told people, and that's why I'm reading the book. But their original reaction was to be terrified, bewildered, tremble, and keep completely quiet about it, even though the evangelist, had told them, go and tell them. It says, he says there, but go and tell his disciples and Peter. Notice the emphasis on Peter, who is the sort of ultimate source of St. Mark's Gospel. So what's happened there? Now, that is really quite a brilliant ending, because it gets you thinking. So, well, hang on, why am I reading this story if they decided they would not tell anybody? The other thing is, it's very much like the most brilliant ending in world literature, which is the ending of the Odyssey, where the two armies are lined up to fight each other, and all hell is about to break loose. And suddenly the goddess of peace descends and imposes peace on them. And that's it. And you think, well, hang on, that's a rather sudden ending, isn't it? Again, the most brilliant ending in English literature is the world lay all before them, with Providence their guide, and with something steps and slow, through paradise made their solitary way. About Adam and Eve leaving the Garden of Eden. It's the most brilliant ending. And this too is a brilliant ending in the sense that it breaks off. The conclusion is what you do with the book. Now, what it's saying, it seems to me, is that you are reading this book. Now it's over to you to carry on the book, that the book carries on being written in human hearts, and in particular in the heart of the reader. So the book is the never-ending story, not the greatest story ever told, but the never-ending story. And I think there's a very famous saint, but he's not a saint, Father de Caussade, who wrote Abandonment to Divine Providence. He says, the gospel continues to be written to this day on human hearts. How you live the gospel. In other words, the book is to become a lived document that you are going to live out. So they were terrified. What are you? Are you going to tell nobody, or are you going to put the book into practice and eventually tell people? Then, of course, this other hand came along and completely wrecked it. But fortunately, the original ending was not lost. And he said, and he basically had read, this is some years later, he'd read St. Matthew and St. Luke, and he did a dice and splice of them, a little summary of what they said, which was, he said to them, go into the whole world and proclaim the gospel to every creature. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved. Whoever does not believe will be condemned. These signs will accompany those who believe. In my name they will drive out demons. They will speak new languages. They will pick up serpents with their hands. If they drink a deadly thing, it will not harm them. They will lay hands on the sick and they will recover. So then the Lord Jesus, after he spoke to them, was taken up into heaven and took his seat at the right hand of God. But they went forth and preached everywhere, while the Lord worked with them and confirmed the word through accompanying signs. It's a nice little passage, but it's a very bad passage, really, in some ways. It lacks none of it has none of the majesty and grandeur of the actual ending as such. And the other thing that it does is this. The ending of St. Mark's Gospel says very clearly, he is going before you to Galilee. So Jesus has gone before and you will follow him to Galilee. And this says that Jesus essentially left. And that is a slight of St. Matthew's Gospel denies that Jesus leaves. He doesn't leave. He stays, I am with you always until the end of time. The St. Mark's Gospel makes it clear that Jesus is in the Gospel and in the heart of the reader of the Gospel. And the reader of the Gospel will carry on that message. So in St. Mark's Gospel, in the original message, Jesus stays. So I've spoken about St. Mark's Gospel. I've spoken for 44 minutes, 30 seconds so far. We've talked about quite a bit about St. Mark's Gospel. Have you got any observations, questions, objections, complaints, etc.? What do you think?
Well, I've got a question.
Oh, go ahead.
So, as a layperson,
Yes.
can you say about the crucifixion that the women were in a distance?
Yes.
Doesn't that it's sort of like it contradicts what St. John says?
Yes.
Because they were up front and heard Jesus say to them.
Yeah. It's. I think it's contradiction is a strong way of putting that over. I think it's a difference in emphasis. That St. Mark wanted to express the distance of the women. St. John wanted to express the closeness of the women. They both had different purposes. God only knows where the women actually were. They can't have been that far away. But some people, one observer sees them as distant, one sees them as close. One of the things is, of course, we've got 4 Gospels, and the Jesus in all 4 Gospels is different.
Yeah.
And that's obvious, or it should be obvious. Now, what's happened, of course, is, as we know, we sort of say, let's read the Gospel. Well, you can't read the Gospel. There are 4 Gospels. Choose which one. And in our minds, we've diced and spliced the 4 Gospels and put them together into a melange. And that means it's a bit like, when children are cooking, they put everything together and they produce some sort of gloop. And each individual flavour loses its individuality in that gloop. But there is individuality in the Jesus of Mark's Gospel, the Jesus of Luke's Gospel, and so on. So, for example, in Mark's Gospel, there's very little teaching. There is a bit, but not very much. Whereas in St. John's Gospel, it's virtually all teaching. There are miracles as well in St. John's Gospel. I think there are, is it 6 miracles or 8 miracles?
Not a lot.
No, not a lot. There's something like 16 miracles, or is it 32 miracles in St. John's Gospel, St. Mark's Gospel? So Mark's Gospel is mainly about miracles.
And in St. John says signs.
Yes, he says signs, semeron, not miracles. St. John never uses the phrase apostles, he calls them disciples. So in St. John's Gospel, the idea, I suppose, is we're all disciples. Whereas in the other Gospels, the apostles, which means the ones who are sent, it means this is about the people who were sent to you so that you might become a disciple. But in St. Mark's Gospel, we're all disciples. It seems there are major differences. I mean, for example, it always used to be said, and everybody knows this, it's clear from reading St. Luke's Gospel that it's written by a doctor because of the bloody sweat of Jesus in the garden. Only a doctor would notice that. And therefore, St. Luke was supposedly a doctor and also supposedly an artist.
Greek.
The Greek. And he was a Greek. Well, this is the thing is Mark was Jewish, Matthew was Jewish, Luke was Greek, and John was Jewish. Yes, Luke was Greek. Yeah. Again, the other thing is they were all working in a language which was, apart from Luke, which was not their own. So Mark would have spoken Greek, but he would have spoken Greek in the same way as a person living in Israel today would speak English. They all speak English. Did you know that? If you go to Israel, they all speak English. Really well, too. All. It's almost impossible to find somebody who can't speak English. Amongst the Jewish population and the Arab population, they all speak perfect English.
One question was probably not directly related to Mark, but it touches on the first you said about books and things.
Yes.
So was there a council that sort of defined then what went into the Bible?
Yes.
So the Gospels were incorporated into the
Yes,
Bible.
it was about
as well, wasn't there?
123, I think, BC AD. They had a synod. The synod of Jamnia. No, there was the Jews had a synod to what was going into the Jewish Bible, and the Christians had a synod about what was going into the Christian Bible. And of course, a lot of books were rejected. Of the rejected books, some of them were written after that synod. People keep on writing rejected books, what are called apocryphal books, books for popular consumption, entertainment, essentially, stories about Jesus which have no historical value. The most famous of those books, of course, being the Gospel of St. James, the Gospel of Pontius Pilate, and of course the Quran is a similar sort of book. It's what's a Gnostic book, a book that has special knowledge and things like that. And of course, don't forget, this carried on into the Middle Ages, writing books about saints, which had absolutely no historical value. So the story of St. George and the Dragon, which was contained in a compendium called the Golden Legendum, meaning that which was to be read. And there was, somebody just said, "Oh, I'm going to write a story about St. George. He's such a good chap." And people want to read this, won't they? And again, those sorts of things. But that sort of religious entertainment is a different sort of type of book.
Was there any reason they chose those four then?
Yes, because they were the canonical Gospels, and they were the earliest Gospels, and essentially the closing of the canon, as they call it. From this point on, no more Gospels and no more writings. Comes with the last writing in the New Testament is the second letter of St. Peter and the letter of Jude. Those are the last, and they probably date from about maximum 120 AD.
And they're after Revelation, are they?
Probably, yes. Revelation's probably the time of Domitian, and Domitian was about 90 AD, I think.
What's Domitian?
Domitian was the emperor. Domitian. He would have been about 90 AD, 92, I think. Domitian was assassinated. Yeah. So at the time of Domitian would be the closing of the canon. Nothing else was written after that.
Can I ask about Mary Magdalene?
Yes.
Why, you're saying that she's from a wealthy family, etc., but why did she have the reputation of being a prostitute?
Well, this is a very interesting question, and this shows how the human mind works. In ancient cities, the Church of St. Mary Magdalene was always built outside the city gate. If you go to Oxford, you'll find a church called St. Michael at the North Gate. There's no North Gate left, but there is St. Michael's Church. It's very old. And then immediately, about 30 yards, 100 yards north, is St. Mary Magdalene's. And the idea, and that was a common thing, that St. Mary Magdalene's was in the suburbs, i.e. outside city. Now, the distinction between city and suburbs was very, very strong, because the city was organised by its aldermen or by its town council. The suburbs were not. So if you were slightly a dodgy person, you would always go and do your dodgy work in the suburbs. And if you remember, Mistress Quickly or Mistress whatever Overdone says in Measure for Measure by Shakespeare, are all the houses in the suburbs, all our houses of entertainment, to be pulled down in the suburbs? The houses of entertainment were in the suburbs. And the most famous place of entertainment was in a suburb, or rather in Surrey. You left London, got in a little boat and crossed over to the South Bank, namely to what's that place called? The Globe Theatre. And that's where you had a really great time. And that was outside London, you see. The Globe Theatre was outside London. And there were also other people plying their wares and so on, and entertainment and so on. And therefore, St. Mary Magdalene became associated with the theatre district, the dodgy red light district of each town. And people assumed that Mary Magdalene, Mary of Bethany, and the woman who was a sinner, all of whom are mentioned in the Bible, 3 separate people, were the same person. The woman who had anointed Jesus, you see, the same person. That's why Mary Magdalene is often shown with a jar of ointment. There's no evidence at all that Mary Magdalene was the woman who had been a sinner or the woman who had anointed Jesus. What it does say is Mary Magdalene was the one from whom Jesus had cast out 7 devils, whatever that means. So she was one of the people who had been healed by Jesus. Just as in the Bible, in the New Testament, how many people are there called James? Well, it depends how you count. But there are at least 3. James, the brother of John. James the Less. James, the brother of the Lord, Bishop of Jerusalem. Were at least 3 people. And the most important of those in the early church was probably James, Bishop of Jerusalem. So when it says that Herod had James executed, which James do you mean? The other thing that was really fascinating and frustrating is in the Jewish world, they didn't have very many names to go around. Nowadays, everybody's called Kylie, aren't they? But in those days, one 1/5 of the men were called Simon. So that means 1/5 of the men. That means 10% of the population was called Simon. So you have Simon, son of John, Simon Peter, Simon. How many Simons are there amongst Jesus? Simon the Zealot. Are there any other Simon? If you look at Jesus, Simon of Cyrene. If you look at Jesus' 12 disciples, how many of them have got different names? You've got James and John, Peter and Andrew, Philip, James, again, Bartholomew. There are 2 Jameses, 2 Judases, and there are 2 Simons. So that's 6.
Well, there are the Jesuses.
Yes, so now you see again, because we've got the Gospels to us, have come to us from Greek, Jesus is called Jesus in Greek, but in everyday life, he was Joshua bar Joseph, son of Joseph. Jesus is Joshua. Yeshua. Joshua. Bar Joseph, being the son of Joseph. He's the only Joshua in the. There are other Joshuas, I think, in the New Testament. Well, there are quite a lot of Joshuas in the Old Testament. But there's no Davids. There's King David, but that's because David wasn't a name, it was a nickname. Nobody knows what King David's real name was. I believe, I was told by my RE master, nobody knows what King David's real name was.
There is no other Davids, is there?
No other Davids. It's very, very strange. And all the women were called Mary, which was Mary of Magdala, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, Mary, the wife of so-and-so, Mary, the sister of X. They were all called Mary. Salome, of course, but that she would share the name with the notorious table dancer, Salome, and head remover, Salome. So you've got 2 Salomes, you've got, I can't think of any other female names. Can you think of Joanna, Anne? Yes, there says Hannah, yeah, Anne, Ruth. There's no Ruth in the New Testament I can think of. Yeah, Hannah. Is there an Anne?
It's Mary's cousin. Mary's cousin.
No, her grandmother. Her mother, Holy Annie, God's granny, but she's not mentioned by name. She's not mentioned by name. Elizabeth. Yeah. But they're very, very few days. One of the things that's very interesting, a book's been written about, a book I've read actually, and that is that they were very keen that if the Gospels are about events that were not verifiable, why mention the names? The fact that Simon of Cyrene is father of Alexander and Rufus, which really does nail him down, not Simon some bloke, was somebody that people would have known about. Or at least several hundred people reading the Gospel will say, "Oh, that's Simon. I've heard of him."
Well, why would they have mentioned 3 Mary, and then some other women came as well? Why would he specifically pick out those 3?
The 3 Marys. I think the 3 Marys are a confabulation of all 4 Gospels.
It's 2 Marys
and Salome.
Yeah.
Because of the reason I gave, because they were rich and powerful or something like that. Because presumably they were hugely influential in the early church. That's the only reason. I mean, usually when you mention somebody by name, it's because people know who you're talking about. Oh, I know what they're talking about. You always like that when you're reading something. Oh, I know what they're talking about.
It's about the same way like that Luke starts his gospel.
Yes.
When it mentions Quirinius.
Yes. All those
known who the governor would have been.
Yes.
So it really does change.
One of the things that's sorry to interrupt you, but one of the things that's very interesting and that's happened is that you read about these people in Scripture. People say, "I've never heard of them," and then suddenly somebody's digging around, and you find the Pilate stone, which is this bit of block of stone, which has got an inscription about Pontius Pilate, and was then reused at a later date in building a temple. It's now come to light, and it's saying Pontius Pilate was the procurator of Judea in the year blah 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 blah, and he did this, and it exactly tells you what you already know from the Bible. Pontius Pilate was here, in other words. And also you have the Magdala stone, which was this stone in the synagogue in Magdala, which has recently been dug up. It's now in the Israel Museum, which tells us that Magdala was a place and an important place, etc., in the time of Jesus. It dates to the time of Jesus. And we also know quite a lot about Herod and people like that. But, this evidence keeps on cropping up. It keeps on coming to us.
Oh, question. Is there actually, like, the original Gospel of St. Mark? Does it actually exist? The book? Or is it just like tradition and...
Well, no, what happened was that obviously there must have been at one stage, Mark wrote it down and people copied it. And then they passed around copies of copies of copies of copies. The originals gradually became shabby and would have been reverently disposed of. They wouldn't have been chucked out, they'd been reverently disposed of, usually by being buried. Then what happened was, and what's happened is, we have in the Vatican Library a tiny fragment which dates from about 120 AD of the letter of St. Peter, second letter of St. Peter, and it accords exactly with the text we have today. Now, the texts we have today are genuine copies of the original texts, because that proves it, because it's the same sort of text. The other thing is there are textual variants, and you can sometimes see where a copyist made a mistake, which was then copied by subsequent copyists, and then it was compared to other copies, and then it was corrected, and so on and so forth. So we can be absolutely certain that the scriptures we have are the scriptures as written, because we do have some very, very old copies. Now, we have very old copies of the prophet Isaiah, for example. We have very old copies of that, because that little boy was playing around in the desert with his goats and discovered a cave where they had put the old Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls were essentially put in the cave because they'd become old and tatty, and they were buried, in other words. There's also the Cairo Geniza, which is a walled-in room which was full of old scrolls. So the word is sacred. You can't chuck it away. You can't throw it in the bin. Therefore, you seal it up in the tomb, essentially. And the scriptures of the Cairo Geniza, the Old Testament scriptures, exactly correspond to what we have in our Bibles today. Now, what this tells us is that when the Muslims claim that the Christian scriptures are hopelessly corrupt, they are talking out of their elbows. It's completely untrue. It is a verifiable fact that the scriptures are healthy texts, not corrupted texts. Going right back to this ancient bit of parchment in the Vatican Library from 125, which I've actually seen. It's kept between two pieces of glass. Oh, yeah, go ahead. I've got to go. Any moment now, I've got to go.
It's something I just heard. It's interesting how Centurion says, truly this is the Son of God.
Yes.
But yet, during the Passion narrative, we have it where Pontius Pilate says to the crowds, what am I to do with your king?
Yeah.
And they say, we have no king except Caesar. Yeah. So in a way, the centurion
is a much better witness than Pontius Pilate, who was a dodgy, local, corrupt official. Whereas the centurion was somebody you could trust. I think, Pontius Pilate, just like that famous character in that very great film. What's that very great film called? Casablanca. I'm just a corrupt official trying to make a dishonest whatever he said. Do you remember in Casablanca? And Pontius Pilate was just like that. He was a dishonest official. Okay, we'll have to stop there because I've got to do the baptism course in 4 minutes. All the best.